Hi everyone, it's Caroline. Happy March. Today's body empowerment episode is based off of a request from one of my viewers, so thank you so much for this topic and theme, and it is the theme of denial. Denial is, it's a loaded topic and theme, but it is a major concept, experience, word that comes up with regards to eating disorder recovery, eating disorder experiences, addiction, body image, negative body image, you name it. Denial is so integrated to our psychosomatic and psychological experiences and journeys. The first word that comes to mind for me with denial is shame. And I know that for me, the times during which I was in denial for my own eating disorder behaviors and self-harm and negative body related and self-related behaviors in general was almost always a response to shame for my behavior, shame for my thoughts, my everything, myself. And the moment I could overcome that shame, the denial slipped away, and then I was able to confront what I was going through and work on healing. You know, denial can last for years, decades, and I feel very strongly that it is so important we start with overcoming our shame, because then there's nothing to deny. And so shame is really terrifying. And the things we deny are terrifying to confront as well. And so I feel like one of the ways individuals can combat denial is if we collectively, as a community, as a society, work on breaking down the walls and barriers of shame so that we as individuals don't have to feel it, right? Like, look at all the social justice movements of the last, I don't know, 100, 200 years have all been built around overcoming shame, overcoming denial, because so many of the oppressions in this country and others in so many cultures are based on making people feel ashamed for who they are, right? Like, you know, people treating women that we should be ashamed to be outspoken, independent individuals. And then that shame gets internalized, and then there's denial of our desires, of our wants, of our power, right? That's happened in our society to people of color, to lots of different religious affiliations. It's happened to queer and homosexual folk, and look at what these movements of social justice are doing. The gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, it's about ownership of power and empowering folks, empowering themselves so that there is no shame in being of color, in being queer, as there should be no shame, obviously. And so then as folks and communities overcome the shame that it's been inflicted unnecessarily upon those groups and communities by hierarchies and oppressors, then we start getting somewhere. We start healing, and then it's the other end of it is for the oppressors to work through their shame. I mean, you know, I'm Jewish, but I also identify as white, and 60 years ago, I probably couldn't have identified as white. I would have just identified as Jewish, but there is white privilege in being Jewish in the United States, and so I identify with that, being aware of that, and there's a lot of guilt to unpack in coming to terms with one's white privilege. I've definitely experienced that, and so overcoming that shame is how I help in my own social consciousness and social justice work. And so, all that said, eating disorders to me are a social justice issue, and so one way that we can work through denial is in overcoming our shame, in recognizing that there is no shame in struggling, right? And again, like, eating disorders are a mental illness. I brought up the gay rights and the civil rights movements those aren't mental illnesses. Those are identifications, backgrounds, demographics, very different things. But the similarity is in the way social justice movements create change and progress, right? So that's the connection I'm making here. So with the mental illness justice movement, right, which is happening across the board in a slew of mental illnesses, whether it be, personality disorders, bipolar disorder, eating disorders, depression. There are these movements of change that we're all a part of, and the point of the movements is to break the stigma of shame. And then when there's no shame, we don't have to deny anything. So denial only perpetuates the problem. Another thing the viewer who requested this topic asked me to address is how parents can contribute and how that only further fuels the eating disorder. So I'm going to answer that, and address that based on personal experience, observation, and anecdotal evidence, meaning stories other people have told me, stories I've experienced, and stories I've observed. That can be one of the most challenging, exacerbating elements of an eating disorder. And that's why it is so important that, again, we look at eating disorder recovery and awareness and prevention as a social justice movement, so that we break the stigma of shame, so that parents don't perpetuate that denial. And I've talked so much with both of my parents about this, and I think one of the fears parents have, and again, this is from observation, from research, from personal anecdote, it appears to me, I am not at this juncture in my life a parent, but from what I can tell, one of parents' fears is being blamed for the eating disorder. So if they admit that their child has an eating disorder, suddenly it's all their fault, which is obviously not the case. I like to really say, with my own parents, that it's not that my parents are to blame for my eating disorder experience. I was a sensitive kid, and I misinterpreted some of the things, some behaviors that I witnessed growing up, and internalized them and tried to control them. And that's not saying that anything drastically awful went up in my house. I had an incredible upbringing, and I was a very fortunate kid. But, my father traveled a lot for work. I think I had a very loud, busy household, and for a super sensitive kid like myself that was probably super anxiety prone, I misinterpreted that, and I tried to find a coping mechanism. And I'm not blaming my parents for that. I'm recognizing that my response to what was intended to be love and encouragement was a misinterpretation, and it manifested into an eating disorder, and so many other factors were contributing causes of my eating disorder. But when I look at what was going on with how my parents or my family affected it, that's one piece, I think, and it's how I interpreted it, right? So I feel, I've witnessed that parents get stuck in denial because they don't want to be blamed. And if we can come to a place as a community of survivors, of patients, of family members, loved ones, where we can communicate on that, and know that our goal is not to blame parents, but to work through the origins and causes, then again, shame goes away, denial goes away. But it is a huge problem, and there are a lot of parents out there and organizations that are trying to combat that blame, that denial, whatever, and I just think it's something we need to talk a lot more openly about. But I do think it's really important to recognize that denial from parents can be very triggering, and absolutely exacerbate, perpetuate, fuel an eating disorder. I've witnessed a lot for myself throughout my own years, having an eating disorder, in recovery, just in general throughout my entire journey. One thing I've noticed is sometimes the desire for self-harm comes from feeling like you're not being heard. So I know that for me, oftentimes, even, if I don't act on it, one of the like incredible experiences I've had in recovery, and in being recovered, is witnessing my thoughts. And I have a journalism background, so it's kind of like I'm an investigative reporter of myself and of what recovery looks like. And one of the things I've noticed is that in being recovered, the moments when I like have any thought that is at all self-destructive, it's typically because I feel like no one's really hearing how hurt I am and how much pain I'm in. And so I know that when I had an eating disorder and when I self-mutilated and self-harmed when I was younger, I've come to really examine all that and see that it was so often about not being heard. And so when people, family members, caregivers are in denial of one's struggle and pain and the severity of one's, in this case, we're talking about eating disorders, it only makes it worse, right? Then you want to like be in more pain so that people can hear how hurt you are. So it's very triggering for loved ones to deny someone of what their struggle is, because the sooner everyone can confront and admit the nature of that struggle, then there is opportunity for healing. So sometimes I think very early on I did feel like no one really got what I was going through. Like when I told my parents a year into having an eating disorder that I was skipping lunch. Like, I've talked a lot with my mom about this. She knew it was a red flag, but it didn't really become a like, oh my God, we need to get Caroline help until I had transitioned into bulimia. And I think I was constantly, throughout that experience with an eating disorder, trying to one-up myself in order to be heard. And so it's so important that we hear each other and that we don't have to resort to more destructive behavior in order to be heard and honored in our pain. And so that's where denial can be very destructive and damaging and dangerous. And so it is, again, it goes back to the social justice elements of it. It is so important that as a community, as a society, we confront these aspects and elements of shame and denial, which I really do feel go hand in hand, so that we have the opportunity to begin healing and recovery, all of us, and individuals in particular, as soon as possible. And then prevention, right? If there's no shame about being in pain in the first place, then there's no need to manifest into an eating disorder or any other destructive behavior, right? Like if we start with helping each other with coping skills from the get-go, that's how we start preventing. If we shift our dynamic as a society to promote and teach self-love from a young age, then we're preventing eating disorders, and we don't even have to go to a place where we're in recovery because we're not even having those, manifestations of pain in the first place. Thank you again to the viewer who suggested this topic, this theme. I hope it's done justice to what you and anyone else would have in mind with regards to denial and shame. I'm really looking forward to hear folks' thoughts on this topic. Again, the dialogue aspect here is crucial. And again, I mentioned the other social justice movements at the beginning because, like I said, the connection is not in the nature of the experience, right? Mental illness versus background, demographic, identity, race, sexual orientation. The similarity is that we should be learning from those justice movements and what they've done in our own effort to combat the stigma of mental illness and eating disorders. So, have a wonderful week. I will see you in the next episode. Thanks. Bye.